Rockin' Royal, rockin' Navy, know y'all with me, let's get it, baby, Rockin' Royal, rockin'
Welcome
Navy,
back to another edition of the Rock and Royal podcast, the podcast for all those who rock the Y on the field, on the court, on the pitch, or anywhere else you may be. I'm Sean Walker, your BYU beat writer for KSL.com, here for another football show. That's right, not a football show like we normally do this early in the week with my co-host Carlos Winston-Haslam. But we're going to talk gridiron, American football, because the long non-conference play is finally over, BYU fans. The dawning of Big 12 play is here, and I've got a really special guest to introduce it. As you guys know by now, Saturday night, 8:30 p.m. at LaVell Edwards Stadium, BYU will open Big 12 play against number 13 Kansas State. And I've brought on to talk about that the ultimate Kansas State insider. He's laughing at me right now. But from a variety of places, Kansas City Sports Network, you probably know his podcast, the Three Mile Podcast, at JL Kurtz on Twitter, John Kurtz Show on YouTube, weekly appointment viewing, by the way, those live streams, if you're a Big 12 guy. You can also check out his newsletter, Open for Business, at ofbnews.com. John Kurtz, thanks so much for joining me, man. Appreciate it.
Hey, I appreciate you, Sean. Thank you.
Well, John, let's jump right into it. Actually, for those maybe BYU fans that are listening to this podcast, reading this transcript, that kind of a thing, who maybe don't know who you are, give me a little kind of a brief summation of how you got into the YouTube show, the newsletter, basically being the guy who's you've kind of been going to bat for the Big 12 for several years now, and you were sort of like that guy during these crazy rounds of conference realignment, which obviously led to BYU being invited to the Big 12. How did you kind of get sort of, I don't want to say pigeonholed because that has a little bit of a negative connotation to it, but you kind of got put into this role of being like the Big 12 guy, I guess, as they say.
Yeah, well, I love that question. It is crazy that I feel like at this point, I'm like a grizzled realignment vet. I've been through so many rounds of this, going back to, well, first of all, I was an intern at Sports Radio 810 in Kansas City, big sports talk station here, in 2010, when like the Nebraska, Missouri, Texas A&M, Colorado realignment round was like just firing up. And I can remember chasing Tom Osborne around with a recorder at, I think it was the Intercontinental Hotel in downtown Kansas City, when like there was all this speculation about that. So my experience technically goes back to that, even though I had no idea what I was actually doing at that point. But yeah, so I graduated from K-State. I'm a K-State guy. I was born the year Bill Snyder got to K-State, 1989. I started going to games when I was a baby. And that was my life, was going to K-State football games. And that's all I wanted to do, was find a way to be involved. So when I graduated, I got a job at a local radio station in town, and I spent a decade there, 2011 to 2021, covering the team on a regular basis. I hosted a daily radio show. I hosted a 2-hour radio show for 10 years. I did pregame radio for football, basketball, and then I did some TV, like your ESPN Plus broadcasts, like some baseball, women's basketball, soccer, that kind of thing. And so after a while, I was getting a little bit burned out. You don't make a ton of money doing things that way. And so I was like, I wanted to get back home to Kansas City, where I was from. And so I started looking for ways to do that. About the time that I did, I had like just started putting some things on YouTube, just as like I had a friend. I'll shout out Carrington Harrison at 610 Sports Radio, now I guess 96.5 The Fan in Kansas City, who had told me, he was like, man, you should probably put some of your stuff on YouTube. Just like, it's the second biggest search engine in the world right now, behind Google. So like you might be able to,
called YouTube. Yeah.
Yeah. It was basically like, I had never thought of it. And he was like, you might be able to make some money if you did that. And this was probably like 2019 that he said that. And so I started taking segments from my radio show, and I would just upload them, just audio only, basically, to YouTube. And, I had a very, very small following there. I may have gotten to the point where it was monetized just a little bit, and I made $50 a month or something, just posting some K-State stuff on there. And then the day that really changed everything, it was about 3 months before I actually left the full-time job in the radio industry to take a marketing job in Kansas City. it was July, I forget the specific day, the day that the Texas and Oklahoma report broke. And I remember doing a segment on my show that was about, hey, what does this mean for K-State? That was really the whole segment of the show. Like, oh crap, like what's going to happen to K-State now? And I put that on YouTube, and it had conference realignment in the title. And I remember, I was getting like maybe 1,000 views on stuff that was interesting to K-State fans. And that video got like 25,000 views or something like overnight. And I was like, well, it seems like there might be something here. Like, I guess I'll keep following this. And that was such a massive story that I just kept making content around it, and it kept getting bigger and bigger. And it all happened really fast. I mean, I was not expecting it at all. And I just kept going with it because, it was crisis mode for me. It was almost cathartic. Like, I'm worried about what's going to happen to K-State. I'm worried about what's going to happen to the conference that I've been watching my entire life. I attended the first Big 12 football game, which was August 31st, 1996, K-State and Texas Tech. Like, I'd been there since the genesis of the league. Right. And I'm like, I don't want to see this end at all. Like, this is horrible. And so I did. I got into this position of like fighting for the league. YouTube channel started to grow. I did wind up finding a marketing job that allowed me to move back, and I still had the flexibility to do the YouTube stuff there. And then as I was back, I obviously still had a pretty big social media following, like Twitter following, that helped me in the K-State world. And I had a couple of buddies, one of whom is still covering K-State on a daily basis, one of whom, like me, had left to make more money, basically. And we kind of put our heads together. We were like, we should do a podcast. So we started the 3-Maw podcast, and then that turned into something really, really cool over the last couple of years, and it's been awesome. And so both of those things just kept growing and growing, and it's just been a really nice mix. I mean, I have a much, much wider audience than I ever did when I was in Manhattan now that I'm not in the industry full time, which is just sort of a sign of the times here. But that's really the backstory. I spent 10 years. I traveled with K-State football all 10 of those years. So I've been to every, I guess, like old guard Big 12 stadium multiple times, like at least 3 or 4 times. It's a part of why I'm so excited to get to LaVell Edwards Stadium on Saturday to check another one off the list, because, so many of those, West Virginia, been there 4 or 5 times. 2012 was the first one, and I love it. Such a unique trip. So I'm all about like unique atmospheres that I haven't seen before. And I know that LaVell Edwards is gonna qualify for that. But yeah, and then, lately I've added the newsletter just to try and up my game a little bit eventually. I mean, I would love to be able to just be doing this stuff full time. So I'm trying to get there. And then I guess shameless plug, go to ofbnews.com if you want to subscribe to the Big 12 newsletter, where I'm basically just trying to give you Big 12. I know how hard it is to get college football news that doesn't feel like it's like, this is, even if it's a big national story, it's like, well, this is all about how it will affect the SEC or the Big 10. So I'm filtering it through like, this is how it will affect the Big 12, and everything you want straight to your inbox there. So it's kind of the idea. I'm doing it the new school way, which is a lot different than when they were teaching me back at K-State from 2007 to 2011.
No, for sure. And you've definitely built yourself up to kind of be that sort of conference-wide source, which, like you said, a little ironic for, just a kid from Kansas City, right? A K-State guy from Kansas City, but you sort of done that. I remember a little bit of a shameless plug. We've got over at KSL.com, we've got a partnership with John Wilner, have for a couple of years. San Jose Mercury News, up and down the West Coast, Bay Area News Group. He was kind of the Pac-12 guy, the Pac-12 hotline, right? It's now the Wilner hotline. But we always had that partnership, that agreement, because of Utah and the Pac-12 and John and the Pac-12 and whatnot. When BYU was joining the Big 12, we looked around to try to find somebody who could kind of be the Wilner of the Big 12 at the time. Obviously, it wouldn't be Wilner, who it kind of is now, I guess, because the Pac-12 is not really much anymore. We may get into that a little bit later, right? But the first name that actually popped in my mind was, well, what about this John Kurtz guy? Like, he's got his finger on the pulse of the Big 12 really well. I know he's a K-State guy, and I think that was actually how I first reached out to you a little bit. And somehow you haven't stopped responding to my texts one way or another. So I really do appreciate that. I don't think I've made you too mad yet. I just looked up that date, by the way. I can't believe it's only been this long. But the very first Texas and OU reach out to the SEC about inclusion. I remember it came out of the Houston Chronicle.
Mm-hmm.
Brett Zwinnerman And that date was July 22nd, 2021.
There you go.
Yeah, I remembered it was late July because I was
Man.
actually sitting in Mountain West Conference Media Days when this broke. And that was a fun experience. Me and Chris Vanini was sitting next to me, and we're both going, well, this got things a little bit awkward and whatnot. And
Yeah.
we're trying to explain to these Mountain West coaches like what this means and all of that. And so that was a little bit of fun. But yeah, July 22nd, 2021, and the rest shall live in infamy, as they say.
It's great. I can still remember, so I was doing a radio show at that point, and I would usually is that article time-stamped? I'm curious if there's a timestamp on the Houston Chronicle article as to when it actually dropped, because I remember I had a whole show prepped for that day, and I was just pulling back into the parking lot. Felt like probably an hour and a half before my show, and I looked down at my phone, and someone texted me like, "What is this about Texas and Oklahoma?" And then I was literally like, "Well, there goes the show I had planned." This is obviously going to control. I had no idea it would control the rest of my life for the next 3 years. So
there's no timestamp on the article, but I do know about roughly when it dropped, because I was sitting in Mountain West Media Days. It was right before Craig Thompson was supposed to address us, which would have been at 10 a.m. Pacific time in Las Vegas.
So earlier in the day. Yeah.
So it was a little bit earlier right there. So I guess Central, it would have been around noonish, probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
There. Yeah, that probably checks out.
That's roughly where I'm guessing. I might be a little bit off, but wild times indeed. And here we are. Well, John, like I mentioned, John is the kind of one of the more eminent voices around the entire conference. Got a lot of talks. Again, John Kurtz Show on YouTube, JL Kurtz on Twitter, ofbnews.com for the newsletter as well. And I thought something fun that we could do. We'll get into some BYU K-State talk a little bit towards the end of this episode. But I wanted to do a little bit of a stock report now that I think every Big 12 team is starting conference play this week officially. We had TCU, UCF last week. So I guess that was maybe like the official beginning. And a couple teams have played conference games that don't count as conference games and that sort of thing. But now that the whole league is really starting up league play, I wanted to revisit some of the preseason top contenders in the conference. And we'll just go through and kind of see if they are still truly contenders for the Big 12 title. And I realize this is all really subjective. Obviously, almost every team is 0-0, right? You hear that cliche all the time. But we won't go through all 16 teams, but I'll pick and choose, and we'll go through several of them. I think maybe most importantly, starting at the top. So as we go through some of this, John, I just want to know, very basic, are you going to buy stock, or are you going to sell stock in these teams to make it to Arlington in that Big 12 championship game? Or is it more of a holding pattern, or are they on a don't buy, to quote our friend Michael from Arrested Development? We've been upgraded to don't buy. So buy, sell, or just simply don't buy are going to kind of be the three options.
Okay, got it.
So what do you say we start with the Big 12 football preseason media poll favorites? And we won't spend too much time on this because this is technically a BYU show, but it is the University of Utah. The Utes were the preseason favorites, although not by much, to be fair. 906 total points, 20 first place votes, one more than John's K-State Wildcats. By the way, we'll get to them in a minute. But the Utes, 3-0 on the year. They're ranked 12th in the country per the AP poll. Wins over Southern Utah, Baylor in a non-conference game. Again, one of those non-conference games that is a conference game but isn't actually a conference game. And then coming off of a 38-21 win at Utah State, their only road game so far of the season. A game they played without Cam Rising, by the way, who has a hand injury, a finger injury on his throwing hand. They get that win in the Battle of the Brothers behind backup quarterback Isaac Wilson, the true freshman as well. How are we feeling about the Utes from a conference perspective? Does it still feel like this is the team to beat, or one of the top teams to beat in Big 12 land? Or are there maybe some signs of unsteadiness?
I'm still buying Utah stock. They were my pick to go to the Big 12 championship game. I guess full disclosure, my Big 12 championship game at the beginning of the year was Utah, Oklahoma State, with K-State third. And I haven't seen enough from any of the three in a different direction to really sway me too much off of that. I mean, I think with Cam Rising, still healthy and playing in games. Like Utah's looked very good. He's looked really sharp. They were pummeling Baylor before he went out, and then they basically just went into park the bus mode, turtle back in its shell mode with Wilson in the game against Baylor. And then honestly, I mean, Wilson looked a lot better, I thought, for the most part against Utah State, particularly in the second half after they got punched in the mouth early.
Yeah, started a little bit slow, but kind of found his footing.
That honestly gave me a little bit more confidence too. Like, hey, even if Cam Rising is going to have another issue later on, he's probably good enough that they could win depending on who the opponent is. So I'm still buying stock in Utah. I think they deserve that kind of respect, especially with Kyle Whittingham there as the coach. The guy's just so rock solid. And that's why, a lot of people say, well, transitioning conferences, those teams traditionally are not going to come in and just win the league in year one right away. And I'm like, I get it, but to have a 7th-year starting quarterback who's played in a couple of Rose Bowls and won a couple of Pac-12 titles, and a coach like Kyle Whittingham that's been around as long as he has, just grizzled vet, it's about as good a situation as you could possibly ask for transferring conferences. So I'm still buying Utah stock there.
Yeah, and I know all eyes are going to be on Provo on that BYU K-State matchup from Big 12 land this weekend. But the Utes also have a pretty good test. I think we'll figure out if they truly are still contenders this weekend. They're playing at Oklahoma State, number 12, number 14 matchup right there. So I think we'll know probably by the end of the day Saturday if Utah is truly still a Big 12 title contender. It's the first official conference game. I think they'll establish whether they are or not as well. Let's move to the number 2 team, your wheelhouse, the team you know best, Chris Kleiman's Wildcats, Kansas State. 19 first place votes in that preseason media poll, 889 points total. That was just behind the Utes, just ahead of Oklahoma State. Again, a little bit of kind of a 3-way logjam, like you touched on some there. K-State also 3-0 on the year. I believe I'm trying to pull up their schedule right now a little bit on the fly. But yeah, coming off of a 31-7 win over Arizona, which again, a Friday night game, that is a Big 12 conference game, but neither one of these teams are 0-1 in conference play. Make it make sense, Brett. Make it make sense. No, I'm just kidding. I get it. Contracts and all of that stuff, they existed. They also got wins over Tulane, which I think is a legitimately good win. And then they pounded UT Martin 41-6 in their other game this year. I probably don't need to ask you this, John, but are you still buying K-State's potential title as potential title contenders, I guess, in the Big 12?
Yeah, I am buying it, and I feel a lot better about saying that after the game on Friday against Arizona. If you would have asked me this question a week ago, I would have been more shaky. I mean, the Tulane game, I do think Tulane is a pretty good team. It was 24-19 in the fourth quarter against Oklahoma this week, for instance. So, like, the defense legitimately is pretty salty, and I actually like their freshman quarterback, redshirt freshman, Darian Mensah, who had a great game against K-State. But K-State's defense was a lot of coverage busts, just leaving guys wide open, and that was really the big concern coming out of that game. Avery Johnson, I know there was a ton of hype, and the hype train probably got out of control for him at quarterback for K-State, but he's getting better. You can see it. He's more raw than I think K-State fans wanted him to be as a passer, but he will make some spectacular throws that are just things that you can't teach. It'll happen every game. He's just right now also got a handful that are just overshooting pretty open receivers, but it's becoming slightly more refined as the weeks go along. And you got to really see his legs be unleashed for the first time against Arizona when he rushed for over 100 yards. And that's where he's just truly about as dynamic as anybody in the country. So defense played a lot better against Arizona, much, much, much better. And that was, we all thought, going to be the strength of the team coming into this year, particularly the secondary, which again had an awful day against Tulane, but they were way better against Tetero, McMillan and company against Arizona. They shut down literally everything. McMillan got his. He went over 100 yards receiving, but they shut down everything else on that Arizona offense. And that gives me confidence that this team is much more like what we thought they were. So especially with an ascending Avery Johnson seeming to refine things as the weeks go on, I'm sure there will still be ups and downs with him the rest of the year, but I think K-State has shown that they definitely have the traits of a contender.
Yeah, full disclosure, I think I was public about this at the time. Hopefully, if not, I'll say it now. I picked K-State to win the conference this year. I thought they were the team to beat. I love Avery Johnson. I love just the type of player he is. I feel like calling him a dual threat quarterback is almost like doesn't explain just how good of a runner and a passer he is. And he can, maybe just as importantly, he can throw on the run extremely well. He finally unleashed his legs some against Arizona, like you mentioned, which I think is really important for his confidence. And it's funny, you say he's a little bit raw as an overall quarterback. He's still young and whatnot. He's also still a 63% passer early in the year, 309 yards and 4 touchdowns in there. So he's still very accurate. And the fact that Avery Johnson is still a little bit raw, still a little bit young, and can get better, absolutely terrifies me for the rest of this league. Because if he really does get like that much better, he is going to be a complete handful for the Big 12 for years and years to come, or at least until he goes to the NFL, whenever that is. So I'm 100% still buying K-State as one of, if not the team to beat in this conference as well. And I think they can show a lot on Saturday night if they can go into a place like Provo and come out with a win. Number 3 on the list, Oklahoma State. They finished with 829 points in the preseason poll, 14 first place votes. So the third of the 3 double-digit first place votes getters. Again, they play Utah this week in a really, really big time matchup. 3-0 on the 2 3-0 teams on the season as well. Mike Gundy's got a little bit of Kyle Whittingham in him, as you were talking about, which just you never really want to pick against the mullet, I think. They let me see. Like I said, I'm trying to pull up a little bit of the results on the fly. Okay, so 44-20 over South Dakota State, 39-31 over Arkansas, very good win over an Arkansas team, and then 45-10 over Tulsa. Haven't necessarily been supremely tested outside of that Arkansas game this year, but maybe what surprises me the most is this is an Oklahoma State team that is 3-0, and Ollie Gordon hasn't necessarily gotten going. Arguably the best offensive player in the year returning to the Big 12. He's been a little bit hot and cold, probably more cold than hot even for the first several games of this season. But I feel like Alan Bowman's been really good, and their offense in some ways almost hasn't missed him. Are you buying, selling, or maybe in like a holding pattern, don't buy, move it up to don't buy on the Cowboys?
I'm still going to say buying, but you bring up a really interesting point there, and that is that Ollie Gordon the last 2 weeks has failed to hit 50 yards rushing. Like, he's been pretty locked down. And I listened to Mike Gundy after the Tulsa game, and he said, look, I mean, they had an extra guy in the box the entire game, even after Alan Bowman started shredding them, which he did to the tune of 396 yards and 5 touchdowns, which is crazy because you think of Alan Bowman as being much more like game manager, not somebody who's going to light you up for 400 yards and 5 scores. So in a way, you could probably argue like, maybe Oklahoma State's ceiling has raised a little bit if they know that Alan Bowman is capable of doing that. They also have a game like the Arkansas game. I mean, they gave up 600 yards of offense to Arkansas, and they were outgained by over 200 yards. Like, that was, I don't know how they managed to pull that off. A pick 6 definitely helped. And another thing to keep in mind, that defense has had some struggles. I mean, they gave up some big plays as well to South Dakota State in week 1. And now they've lost Colin Oliver for maybe the year. It sounds like there's some speculation he could come back at the end of the year, but he's arguably their best defender, their best pass rusher for sure. So they've already taken a really crucial injury hit there. So there are reasons why I might be a little bit shaky there, but again, it's Mike Gundy. The guy just figures it out. I mean, they lost by 26 to South Alabama at home last year, and they made the Big 12 championship game. So I've got to still stick with buying, but that is one that I definitely have my eye on. And obviously we're going to find it. We'll find out everything we need to know about Oklahoma State the next 2 weeks, because they play, as you mentioned, Utah at home this week, and then they're going to Manhattan next week. So we'll know everything we need to know about the Cowboys in the next 2 weeks. So it really doesn't even matter if I'm saying buy or sell right now, because you'll just need to come to me in 2 weeks and we'll all know the answer to that at that point.
Yeah, 100%. I think I'm in a little bit more of a holding pattern because of that, because the schedule makers of the Big 12 don't like nothing, no Mike Gundy or something, giving them Utah and K-State back to back. That just feels like one heck of a gauntlet to start conference play, and really let you know I think you're right. I think it'll let us all know exactly what these Cowboys are and if they are going to wind up being true contenders for a trip to Arlington. Again, even going 0-2, I think to start the league won't technically, officially, certainly not mathematically eliminate them from a championship game appearance, but it might be really tough if they lose these next 2 games. So yeah, we'll probably know all we need to know about this Oklahoma State side in the next 14 days or so, for real. Let's go the last 2 teams that received first place votes, and then maybe I'll ask you if you've got any kind of dark horse or other teams that are sort of ascending in a lot of ways. Kansas received 5 first place votes, 772 points in the Big 12 football media preseason poll. That's 4th overall. It's been a rough start to the year on the Jayhawks, though. 1-2 on the season. Their only win 48-3 against Division I newcomers, FCS newcomers Lindenwood. And then they go and drop a 23-17 setback to Illinois, which is now ranked in the top 25. And then a 23-20 home loss to UNLV, which propelled the Rebels into the top 25 as well. I'm not sure either one of those games, Jan, are terrible losses per se. I actually think UNLV is a pretty good team. Maybe that's a little bit of my West Coast bias sneaking in there. And then it's tough to go and play a Big Ten team, and that was a close game. Like, I understand kind of how that could have gone away with them, but I do feel like there's a lot of momentum that's being taken off of this Kansas team that started the preseason at the very least, if you believe in votes and polls and that sort of thing, as at least a contender for a Big 12 championship game. I can't imagine there are too many people that still feel that way about the Jayhawks.
No, I mean, they're in a weird spot because, I mean, it was never going to be a likely scenario that a Big 12 team would get an at-large bid to the playoff. I think that's just the unfortunate reality. Possible, but not likely. So really, you were looking at this year saying Kansas win the Big 12, go to the playoff. That's all still there for them, but they have been a complete disappointment so far. I mean, I do not know. Well, I guess I have a theory on what is going on with Jalen Daniels, and it's probably a combination of things, to be honest. But that's really the thing. Like, their defense in some ways has been almost better than expected. Like, their offensive line has been pretty good for the most part. There was a stretch where they were struggling to run the ball a bit against UNLV, but their overall numbers are pretty good. Devin Neal is still a star. But, man, I mean, that passing game, it's just not working right now. Jalen Daniels has 6 interceptions through 3 games, and they've just been backbreakers. Like, he throws the pick 6 right before halftime against Illinois on a little screen pass. That is the difference in the game. And then UNLV, they're dominating in the first half. It's 14-3, then it's 17-6. They have the ball before halftime. Looks like they may add some extra points. He throws a bad pick that gets run almost all the way back. And then UNLV, on basically a coverage bust by Kansas on a wild last play of the half, scores a touchdown. And again, like, that's what flipped the game. That's what happened. That's how they lost the game. So unless Kansas can get that fixed, and Kansas fans right now are talking about bench JD6, bench Jalen Daniels, that's giving up on your season. Their hope is that Jalen Daniels gets this figured out. I think the problem is Andy Kotelnicki, their offensive coordinator, who's now at Penn State, is a real star. I've been proud of that take for a couple of years now, because I was saying that 2 years ago when Jalen Daniels burst onto the scene in September of 22. Like, this offensive coordinator is just scheming guys wide open. He is really good. And I think Jeff Grimes, who, I mean, I know BYU fans are familiar with Jeff Grimes, probably more fond of him than Baylor fans are. You'll get some mixed reviews on that, but Kansas fans are wanting to look. I was looking at social media all day today. Kansas fans are wanting to run that dude out of town already. I mean, Travis Goff can't tweet anything, the athletic director at Kansas, without getting fire Jeff Grimes tweets all over the place. So they're not happy. I'm sure some of it is a drop-off. I'm sure some of it is just not having the cohesiveness, the continuity that had developed there with Kotelnicki. And I think some of it is probably just some rust. I mean, Jalen Daniels only played 9 games the last 2 years. He missed a ton of time last year. So I think all of that is really hurting them right now. And obviously, I'm selling the stock, but that is one that I would at least be keeping an eye on for later on. I think there's still enough talent there, and they have a manageable enough schedule that it's possible it could turn around. It's not looking very likely right now.
Yeah, I agree. I'm selling stock in Kansas. I don't. It doesn't feel like Jalen Daniels is the same guy that he's been for the last year and a half, 2 years. I think that offensive coordinator change was actually massive. And I know Jeff Grimes is a very good OC. He's very good at what he does. I just wonder sometimes about the fit with his type of offense and Jalen Daniels. And in particular, it doesn't feel like they're utilizing the run game as well as maybe they could. They've got Devin Neal back there, and it just doesn't seem like he's being quite as effective. I know there are a lot of parts that have to go into the run game, from the offensive line to receivers, downfield blocking, that kind of thing. So I don't want to throw that all on Devin by any means, or even entirely on the play caller like Jeff Grimes, but it just doesn't feel like something's quite clicking with this group that was maybe they were based a little bit more into Kotomiki than a lot of us outside of the Sunflower State maybe want to admit as well. So I'm definitely selling that stock. Although I would maybe retain, like you said, maybe retain 1 or 2 units just in case they start to come back around a little bit. But yeah, I mean, so maybe not a total fire sale, but we're having a fire sale. Another Arrested Development reference.
Yeah.
So maybe not a total fire sale on that stock, but keep 1 or 2 units. But yeah, I wouldn't be afraid to sell too much on there from the Jayhawks as well. Let's go to the last team that picked up preseason media poll votes. That was Arizona. They came in 5th, 3 first place votes, 762 total points. I think a lot of that was because of their returning quarterback, Noah Fafita, Taitaroa McMillan, the all-everything wide receiver who has been as good as advertised or better. But your Wildcats got a pretty good look at Arizona last week, and obviously we discussed a little bit how that went. Arizona now 2-1 on the season, coming off of that 31-7 loss to K-State. Also wins over New Mexico and Northern Arizona as well, the in-state FCS game. Taitaroa McMillan, still very good. Noah Fafita, I think even, still very good. But it does feel like maybe a little bit of shine was taken off of this team from a game which, again, I don't think it counts in the Big 12 standings officially, but maybe puts a little bit more of a ceiling on where these Wildcats are because of how they did against the other Wildcats, right?
It's a pretty similar situation, honestly, to Kansas. They still are 0-0 in the Big 12. They could go out there and win the league. And in fact, the newsletter I do, Open for Business, ofbnews.com, I did an informal anonymous player survey at Big 12 Media Days where I talked to like 21, 22 players, asked them who they thought would win the league, and Arizona actually got the most votes. But they have not looked good at all this year because outside of the game against K-State, they were in a 12-10 game in the fourth quarter with Northern Arizona at home. And before that, they gave up 39 points to New Mexico. So the defense was not very effective at all in that game. New Mexico is not a very good team. So they have been, it feels to me like, again, another team in transition that's being affected by some of that. It's not the offensive coordinator this time. It's an entirely new coaching staff, obviously, with Brent Brennan, who's never been a coach at the Power 4 level. Yes, they got Taitaroa McMillan and Noah Fafita to stick around, the quarterback receiver combo, which was huge. But they had some big hits. I mean, they got hit at the running back position, for instance, pretty hard to the portal. There were some guys that followed Jed Fish to Washington. So it just feels like the learning curve of a new coach, the learning curve of a new conference, and of a program that, frankly, I mean, they had an awesome year last year. They had the longest winning streak in the country until they lost to K-State the other night.
Yeah.
Awesome team last year, but that's not a program that's been used to doing it like year in, year out. I think there's something to be said for that too, that they just haven't had the stability as a program. So adversity probably hits a little bit different for some of those guys there. So I'm definitely selling. And in fact, I would probably sell, like, if we're keeping some stock behind, I would keep a little bit more Kansas stock behind than I would Arizona. They're way too much of a one-man show right now. McMillan is every bit as good as you hear people talking about, and even more. He's incredible, but they just don't have much else on offense. I mean, they have to force feed him the ball. Nobody else is doing a whole lot. And the defense, I think, is just okay. It's pretty average. So it's just not a lot there for me to really like outside of Taitaroa McMillan.
Yeah, for sure. And again, we're talking about, we talked a little bit about teams that didn't get any favors from the scheduling committee. I don't think this Arizona team got any favors, at least with how they're starting. Big 12 play. They're going to Utah and then to BYU, sandwiched around a game against Texas Tech. They might not be favored in any of those first three games of conference play. The BYU game, I think mostly because of the road atmosphere and LES and that kind of thing. They have to come to Provo. So that maybe is the biggest tell there. But I want to be shocked. It wouldn't shock me. I don't know if I necessarily would pick this, but it wouldn't shock me if they lost all three of those games to officially open conference play, and then suddenly they're in a lot of trouble. Maybe I'm telling on myself a little bit, but I am not high on this Arizona team at all. Maybe they're still too much of a Pac-12 team to make a little bit of a Pac-12 Big 12 rivalry joke to truly compete in the Big 12. I don't know what is. And again, teams can turn around and teams can get better and things can change. If Wildcats want to take this as a challenge, that's totally fine. I'm so small time that they probably don't know who I am or what I'm saying, but I just don't know if I can really take too much about this Arizona team in terms of being a Big 12 title contender as well. I think it's down to kind of the big three, at least from the preseason side. It's down to kind of the big three and maybe a little tiny bit of Kansas. We won't go through. There are 16 teams in the conference, John, so I don't want to necessarily do this with all 16 teams, but of the remaining teams and how they started the year. So in order of that preseason poll, Iowa State, West Virginia, UCF, Texas Tech, TCU, Colorado, Baylor, BYU, Cincinnati, Houston, Arizona State. Is there one team that jumps out at you as maybe they were more of a dark horse contender in the preseason that you suddenly look at and you see what they've done so far and you go, you know what, this is a team that could win the league or at the very least could wind up in Arlington at the end of the year?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to just narrow it down to one. I think there are a lot of teams kind of in like a next tier outside of the top three, K-State, Oklahoma State, Utah, which would still be my three there, not in that order. But look, you got to give Iowa State respect. They've got the best win in the league so far going on the road at Iowa, particularly winning that in comeback fashion. They've also got like a schedule that sets up very nicely. They're playing Arkansas State this weekend, and then their Big 12 schedules, Houston, Baylor, West Virginia, UCF, which now is looking like that should be a really big game, but they could pretty easily get on a roll. Texas Tech at Kansas, Cincinnati, and then they end the year at Utah and hosting K-State. So I just think the way that sets up, they could build a ton of momentum and be feeling really good about themselves by the time those two games come around. And UCF, I've been high on them since the offseason, and I hear from a lot of UCF fans on Twitter. I know they're fired up right now. There was a heck of a comeback that they had down 28-7 at TCU to storm all the way back and win. RJ Harvey is playing like the best running back in the conference right now in a league that's full of great ones. They needed to show me that they had like that kind of toughness, that they could grind out a game like that and do it. And Sonny Dykes said after the game that they wore them down, which is not anything I would have expected about a UCF team that you still thought might be developing Big 12 depth and toughness to be able to do something like that. So I think UCF deserves a mention for sure in this conversation. I'm still a little more subdued probably than like some UCF fans on it. I need to see them do it consistently over the course of a season, but that was definitely a step in the right direction. I think they're better than they were last year. And then you're talking about, look, obviously BYU's 3-0. They've got a really good defense. They've got a quarterback who I know is a little bit polarizing, but has shown some really high-end stuff, and Pro Football Focus would certainly validate that. So I think there's reason to be optimistic there if you're a BYU fan to try and stay in contention. Maybe we should shout out Arizona State. They're 3-0. I would have never thought that. I thought they honestly
3-0 ASU, yeah.
Yeah, I thought they could go 0-3, to be honest, looking at their non-conference schedule. It was fairly tricky at the outset of the year, but clearly Kenny Dillingham's made them a lot better. I don't think they will truly be a contender for the league, but they are 3-0. I feel like just to give them some respect, they probably deserve a mention. Outside of that, I think that's about where I would stop the list of teams that I would mention, at least in that conversation right now, or on the periphery of that conversation. Maybe Texas Tech. They got things back together against North Texas this past week, but I've never been a huge believer in them so far this year. So yeah, I think the top two there outside of the top three, if we're going to do a top five in the Big 12, would be Iowa State and UCF would be kind of the next level for me.
Yeah, that's a good call. And by the way, that Farmageddon game at the end of the year, Iowa State for K-State, if there is a berth in the Big 12 championship on the line for the winner of that game, so help me, that could be a lot of fun.
Boy, it would be fun, but that'd probably take years off of my life. I can tell you that much, because that's just turned into such an intense rivalry lately. But man, it would be great. It would be unbelievable for the league if that happened.
Yeah, it'd be really good. I also love UCF as a potential contender. ESPN FPI, I don't know if you follow that metric. I'm a little bit hit and miss with it sometimes. Apparently, ESPN FPI has UCF as the favorite.
They love
the
UCF
conference right now.
Yeah,
like
they love
them. I understand why a little bit. I mean, this offense is absolutely, like, this Gus Malzahn offense is absolutely rolling. 57 points against New Hampshire, 45 against Sam Houston State. Obviously, they had the slaughter knocker against TCU, or they came back to win 35-34. But they're scoring points at a very high clip. RJ Harvey, like you mentioned, one of, if not maybe the best running back in the league, one of the better running backs in the country, in my opinion. He's right up there with guys like Ashton Genty at Boise State. I mean, he's on the short list right now, I think. And an extremely favorable schedule with so many of the games that they need to win coming at home in the bounce house. I don't think you can totally set that aside. Oh, and by the way, if you want to talk about the Big 12 potentially trying to sneak a second team into the 12-team college football playoff, why not UCF? You know, maybe like a 1-loss UCF, 2-loss UCF that doesn't win the conference title, but is sitting there with a win over Florida.
Could help.
I mean, that's good. I know what Florida is right now. I know the standing that Billy Napier has there from a lot of SEC fans. But that brand of a win can still bring a little bit of cachet, I think, to a team that could wind up being double-digit win total good this year as well. So I really like the Knights. I don't know if I'm quite as high as ESPN FBI on them, but I think they're certainly in the conversation and should probably be on the relatively short/medium list to at least make it to Arlington to that Big 12 championship game. I would, if you haven't bought any stock in UCF yet, I would definitely start chipping away and buying a little bit now before it gets a little too expensive. So, yeah, that was actually a lot more fun than I thought it would be, John. I'm not gonna lie, that was way more fun.
Yeah, no, it's good stuff, and I'm with you, man. Definitely buy your UCF stock now. I would definitely do that.
Well, speaking of buying stock, we're both going to be buying stock in the Provo Tourism Association this weekend. That was a terrible transition, but Saturday, BYU, number 13, Kansas State, Big 12 opener, official Big 12 opener, I should say, for both teams at 8:30 p.m. Mountain Time from the base of the Wasatch Mountain Range. You can find it on ESPN, radio stations across the country, BYU Radio, KSL locally in Utah. Shout out, who's the official radio broadcaster for K-State right now?
Like the play-by-play voice?
Yeah.
Wyatt Thompson, who is one of the nicest human beings you will ever meet.
I've met him a time or two, I don't know him super, super well, so just want to make sure to give that shout out. But yeah, both of them 3-0, both of them opening Big 12 play. This is maybe the biggest test that K-State has faced, certainly on the road this year. Is that may be fair to say? BYU a little bit more battle tested when it comes to the road. They're the only, I didn't realize this until literally about like 4 hours ago. BYU is the only Big 12 team that is 2-0 on the road this season.
Yeah.
Obviously, they're one of the only Big 12 teams that played 2 non-conference road games, so that narrows the bar significantly. But Cougs are back home to host the Wildcats. It's the first meeting between the two schools since a certain Cotton Bowl back in 1996, or technically 1997, I guess. 1996 season. Fond memories for BYU fans. Not so much, I would imagine, for K-State fans. That 19-15 game that included 291 passing yards and 2 touchdowns from Steve Sarkisian and a late interception to seal it from BYU's Omar Morgan as well. What's the vibe like right now from Manhattan to the greater Kansas City area to, K-State fans in general? Hashtag Emon Nation. What's kind of the vibe like for this game, John? How are K-State fans feeling about it?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, I love the idea that BYU is doing the Cotton Bowl throwback uniforms for it. I think that's such a cool touch for this game. And I very vividly remember being incredibly upset with my parents who they went to that Cotton Bowl. They did not take me at 7 years old. And I was very, very angry with them for that. I watched the game with my grandparents instead. And there are K-State fans that'll still tell you if we had instant replay that Kevin Lockett was inbounds on the touchdown pass that he had, that would have been the go-ahead TD pass. Honestly, I haven't seen it in so long, I can't remember. I just remember people being mad about that at the time. But it was a great game. Great game. I actually still have pretty fond memories of that whole experience, and it was such a cool deal for K-State to be there. But
as far as your parents not taking you to the game.
Yeah, I mean, despite that, yes, I always still give my dad a little bit of grief about that one. But as far as the team right now, I think everybody is feeling much more confident, just a lot better after last week. Like Tulane, I mean, you're right. This is easily the toughest test I think K-State has had so far this year, particularly on the road. Tulane is a nice tune-up. I'm glad they have that under their belt as opposed to just playing 3 home games before going and taking on this road test. But Tulane, smaller stadium, the weather, I think, kept some people away that day too. They were going through like a tropical depression the day that K-State was playing there in New Orleans. So definitely not as loud, not even close to as loud as what they're going to experience at Lavelle Edwards. And you do have a sophomore quarterback who will be making just his 5th career start in Avery Johnson. So there's reason to be concerned about all that. And I think, look, I looked at it at the beginning of the season, just to be candid, and said, we're going through on our 3 Mile podcast and like picking games, what the record would be and which games they'll lose and win before the season. I had K-State at 9-3, and I actually had them losing this game because I think they'll be up for the Arizona game on Friday with Fox national TV Friday, top 20 matchup. And then they have the Oklahoma State game next week, which is going to be the same type of deal, I'd imagine. It's going to get some really good TV coverage and a lot of attention. And Oklahoma State, a team that they know they always have battles with, and it could decide, the Big 12 championship race. And in between, you got this trip to Provo, which is not an easy place to play. It's not a place that they've been before. And it's a team that should be tough. And now, especially after having seen BYU through 3 games this year, I mean, they feel like a very tough, gritty kind of team, particularly with the defense being the backbone that they have there. So I do think this is tricky. Plus, the game being so late, that's kind of a new thing for K-State, and I think probably enhances the atmosphere at Lavelle Edwards. So I would say most people are pretty cautiously confident, cautiously optimistic about K-State's chances to win the game. Certainly not overly cocky here, but definitely more confident after seeing a really complete effort last Friday against Arizona when there were a ton of concerns about the defense before that.
Yeah, this feels like a game where, first of all, I mean, just on talent and overall production, what they've done this year, Kansas State probably should win this game. There's a reason why they're 6.5-point road favorites, I think. So just based off of everything on paper, it kind of does feel like a game that K-State should win and should win by, at least a good touchdown or so. But I kind of agree with you. This also feels in a lot of ways like the ultimate trap game for the Wildcats. You've got Arizona as the unofficial welcome to conference play. And you've got obviously that game against Oklahoma State that will wind up deciding so much of Kansas State's season. And then in between, you've got this trip to Provo that I can't imagine was circled by a whole lot of players or coaches or probably even fans at the start of the year, especially for a BYU team that, is coming off of a 5-7 season. They're picked 13th in the league. They were just kind of there. I don't think anybody thought necessarily like overly negative of this BYU team, but they certainly weren't one of the top teams in the conference for the longest time. And so this game just sort of slipped under the radar. I want to be surprised if this game kind of slipped under the radar a little bit for K-State. Meanwhile, on the other side of the coin, this is BYU's first home game in 3 weeks now. They went to SMU, to Wyoming, 2 teams that turns out now probably shouldn't have ever been favored against BYU, certainly not that SMU team at the very least. And then Wyoming is going through plenty of troubles themselves. So obviously BYU picks up those wins, but this team is really excited to get back home, not only for a conference opener, but a ranked team in Kansas State. Then you mentioned the night game, the hashtag Vampire Cougs coming out. There's this branding around Elias at night that I think is a little bit deserved, even if the numbers are now a little bit overinflated. They're not totally, this BYU team's not totally invincible when they play at night, but there is still a little bit of kind of cachet behind that atmosphere as well. It just feels like this maybe has been a bigger game for BYU for a while than it has been for K-State. And now a lot can change in a week, right? If this is what the godfathers of college football podcasting, Solid Verbal, like to call a letdown look-ahead sandwich for Kansas State, you got to think that maybe somebody has kind of recognized that. Coaches are drilling into it. Certainly Coach Kleiman probably drilling his players into that to make sure they're ready for BYU. They're 3-0 for a reason, yada, yada. And really all it takes is a week and they should be able to beat them. But I don't know, like it does feel like there's been maybe in some ways almost more put into this game from the BYU side than from the K-State side. So again, like I feel like Kansas State is the better team, but there may be some upset alert potential in the corners of Manhattan for this game.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think you laid it all out there. Like situationally, I think almost everything favors BYU here. And I would agree. Like if you line the teams up on a neutral field, K-State probably would be, 7 to 10 point favorite, something like that. But situationally, so much is working in favor of BYU here because this is a chance. Like people are looking around now like, okay, like we see you BYU 3-0. That's a nice start, particularly the centerpiece of that being the win at SMU, which Big 12 fans certainly thank you for that. But can you back it up? Like, is this legit or is it another decent start like last year before the wheels kind of fall off? And like, what does this mean from Jake Retzloff that PFF has him as the 4th highest rated Power 4 quarterback so far this season? Will it hold up against a Big 12 defense that traditionally has been pretty good under Chris Kleiman? They have a lot to prove, and I think BYU really knows it, whereas K-State kind of just went through this validation process last week. People are starting to have some questions, and then they said, oh, no, okay, K-State's legit. They're fine. They're what we expected them to be this year. So I do think all of that fits in. And the other thing, this was a hot topic on the 3 Mile podcast at the beginning of the year, or before the season, rather, when we were talking about game by game. Chris Kleiman typically has a dud kind of out of left field. Like, what was that performance every single year? If you go back to like 2019, his first year, they should have had a 9-win regular season, but they lost a game at home at the end of the year to a sub 500 West Virginia team who was really scuffling. And you were just like, what was that? Where did that come from? K-State had been playing great. They beat Jalen Hurts in Oklahoma right before that. And then they just lay an egg at home against West Virginia. 2020, they lost to Arkansas State at home, which obviously I don't think I need to say much more than that. 2022, they lost to Tulane. Now that game looked a lot better at the end of the year when Tulane won the Cotton Bowl. But at the time, the offense did nothing, and you're like, what is that? They lose at home to Tulane. They go on to win the Big 12. Last year, they played on a Friday night at Oklahoma State when Oklahoma State was still in, like, losing to South Alabama mode. And K-State play. I mean, that, in terms of just effort and how sharp they look, that might be the worst game of the Chris Kleiman era, I think, to me. They were just dreadful. And you're like, where did that come from? Like, what happened there? So part of my calculus when I was looking at this before the year thinking this is a spot where I think they very well may lose, is that I thought this makes all the sense in the world that this would kind of be a game that K-State fans wouldn't be thinking about as like a potential loss. But I'm looking at the situationals for it and how it all lines up, and knowing that Chris Kleiman kind of has one of these in him every single year is like this feels like the game that it could and maybe would be. So that, I think, is another part of the concern that most K-State fans who are at least like paying attention would certainly have here. Now, my co-host Cole would push back and say, well, John, Tulane was actually good. Oklahoma State was actually good. Some of these losses are not as bad as you're making them out to be because of how the team's like, I mean, okay. But at the time, it certainly felt bad, and they were not very crisp, sharp efforts. So you got to hope, if you're a K-State fan, it's not going to be another one of those nights.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the hope for most K-State fans. And like I said, the fact that this is being recognized as a potential for a little bit of a letdown, a little bit of a trap game, is probably a good sign for this coaching staff, because I think generally Chris Kleiman has his teams prepared. And I'm not just talking about his K-State teams, but over the course of his career, they've traditionally been very prepared for games like this when they can make a little bit of a statement showing, I think. And I think winning at altitude at LaVell Edwards Stadium over a 3-0 BYU team would qualify as a bit of a statement for this Wildcat side. I am reminded of last year. BYU likewise started 3-0, not a super impressive 3-0, but 3-0 nonetheless. Turned a lot of heads with a 38-31 win over Arkansas, which I think was kind of similar to that win over SMU, turning some heads as well. And then, do you remember, John, how Big 12 play actually started for BYU last year?
Well,
BYU actually opened the season against a team from Kansas.
That's right. Well, I definitely remember the Kansas game and being like, man, if BYU could just not turn over the ball, they would have won. And I was rooting for them. So.
There was a little bit of that, yeah.
Yeah.
38-27 was the final score at David Booth, Kansas Memorial Stadium in Kansas. One of the last games that team hosted there, obviously, because it's now being shut down for extensive renovations. I still want to get out to a game at, what's it called now? Sporting Kansas City Stadium, Children's Mercy Park for that KU football team.
Mm-hmm.
I've only been there one other time. It was for an MLS Cup, RSL versus Real Salt Lake versus Sporting Kansas City. I just want to know how football is played there. Like that just fascinates me.
K-State had a spring game there in like 2014, maybe, or would it have been 13? I do remember watching a K-State spring game there. It was kind of cool. It was a fun experience.
Yeah, I kind of secretly wish that BYU was playing at Kansas this year, just so we could see that, obviously. But KU's coming up to Provo instead. I guess that will have to do for BYU fans there, though. But yeah, so you were talking about last year and what this BYU team did, starting 3-0 and then really sputtering in a lot of ways down the stretch. Just 2 wins in all of conference play, including that 4-game losing streak under Jake Retzlaff to end the year. I think it was 5-game losing streak total as well. And I just can't help but note kind of some of the similarities in there, which make me think this is probably a game, again, that Kansas State should win. But you never know. I mean, that's if I really knew how these things were going to go out, I wouldn't be podcasting or writing about sports or anything like that. I'd be living down in Vegas, actually making some real money on this action. So this game does feel weird. But I probably wouldn't pick K-State to lose either, unless something really, really weird happens in there as well. John, is there anything else about this game that just kind of stands out to you? Or I've got a non-football kind of way to wrap this up for you as well. But anything that you're looking forward to between these two teams, the Memorial? You mentioned the BYU throwbacks. They do have 1996 throwback uniforms, which I'm not going to lie, they're pretty cool. They look pretty good. They got the icy white with the old school Y, the royal blue helmets. They do look pretty great. I won't lie.
Well, I am a sucker for all white uniforms. I love them dearly. So that's a part of the appeal for me. I think those look great. It will be very weird for me watching K-State playing in home uniforms on the road. Like that's definitely going to be a new experience there, but I'm kind of excited for the novelty value in that. I mean, really, my other thoughts about this game are just like how excited I am to experience the atmosphere, which I know I kind of alluded to earlier. But I mean, first of all, like BYU fans have just been so incredibly welcoming and nice and awesome ever since I started on this YouTube journey, where obviously we wound up getting a lot of Big 12 fans in, and there are a ton of passionate BYU fans that hang out in the live chats and take in all of that content. I appreciate them immensely, and I had people offering me tickets and so many people giving me suggestions on what to do and where to go in Provo. So like, I appreciate the fan base so much that I'm really excited to come see what it's all about. And I was really happy, honestly, other than the fact that, I'm old and I typically go to bed pretty early. So like a 9:30, my body clock central time kickoff is going to be that'll be a challenge for me, but I suppose I'll probably survive. But I wanted a night game because I feel like that's the full kit and caboodle in terms of the atmosphere and being able to see that. So I am just very excited for the entire experience of all of it. I'm going to get to go on the BYU TV pregame show as well. So there's just a lot of really cool things I think that are going to come out of the weekend. So very grateful for everybody who's been so welcoming to me with that.
Yeah, we'll make sure to say hi to friend of the show, Dave McCann, and Spencer Linton, and Brian Logan. All the guys, they do it. BYU TV folks do a great job with their pregame and their postgame as well. They're really, really good. Can I give you then one, we'll call it an assignment, little piece of homework for your trip to Provo? I know you mentioned you've had a couple of suggestions and that sort of thing for what you and your better half to do during your trip to Utah.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
But I know you're from Kansas City, and Kansas City, I can confirm, has, I'll just say it, the best barbecue in the continental United States. I've had Texas barbecue. I've had Kansas City barbecue. Austin area barbecue is very good. I don't want to knock on it too much. So Texas barbecue, very good. But I got to give the nod to Kansas City barbecue. There is a barbecue joint in Utah County. It's actually not too far. It's run by a BYU alum. He's actually a former BYU hockey player, their club hockey team. And he does a lot of work with the athletic department, in particular the football team and whatnot, catering and that kind of thing. I need you to go there, and I need a review of this barbecue place. Okay. I think it's Texas-style barbecue for the most part. It's called Bam Bam's Barbecue.
I've had it recommended to me already. So
yep,
yeah.
Okay. So Bam Bam's Barbecue on State Street in Orem. Cam from Bam Bam's, you get one free mention, by the way. This is your only freebie. The second one, you're gonna have to buy some airtime as well. But I need you, Kansas City's own John Kurtz, to go to Bam Bam's Barbecue, order whatever you need. The brisket is awesome. The pulled pork is fantastic. I'm a big fan of their pulled pork. But really most of their stuff is good. And I need a full review either on Twitter or your YouTube channel, whatever it is. If you want to pull out your phone and make a video, post it up. I just need a full review about how that barbecue compares. I don't think it's going to be as good as Kansas City barbecue, but I think it stacks up fairly somewhat reasonably well. And honestly, it's probably the best that we have to offer in the state of Utah.
Okay.
So can you accept that mission?
I will do my absolute best. As you mentioned, like I will be there with my girlfriend who has a lot of things planned for us, but I think I have some wiggle room, particularly on Saturday. So I'm going to try to make it over there because I had another listener of the show actually earlier today emailed me and said that like, you got to try this. And so I definitely love barbecue, obviously, being a kid that grew up in Kansas City. So yes, I will. The best I can do is say I will make every effort to get over to Bam Bam's Barbecue.
That's all we can ask for. And honestly, we'll follow up a little bit more. If you can't make it, let me know. I'll pick up some Bam Bam's Barbecue on my way, and I'll give you a half plate in the press box or something like that.
Oh, okay.
Maybe we'll do that. Maybe we'll work that up or something in there. I think I may be able to. I'll have to film that one though if we go that route. So, full disclosure. I'm doing it for hashtag content purposes.
Yes.
If we do have to go that route. So awesome. Well, John Kurtz at John Kurtz Show on YouTube. You can find him JL Kurtz on Twitter, or as always, Open for Business, the unabashedly Big 12 biased newsletter, ofbnews.com. You can check it out. Sign up there as well. Really good stuff from John on a variety of platforms. And like I said, he really is. I still consider you in a lot of ways the John Wilner of the Big 12, just for the way you've been able to kind of bring this new group together, all 16 teams, well, 15 teams at least, you know who you are. But for the way that you've been able to kind of bring the conference together and kind of rally around and coalesce around the YouTube show. The 3 Mile podcast, also check it out, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. I've seen it on a couple places, most anywhere I think you can get podcasts there. And Kansas City Sports Network as well. That's still a thing. I think that you guys got a website over there, right?
Yes. Boy, this is bad. I just do my 3 Mile thing. I just always say, search 3 Mile wherever.
Yeah. If you need the 3 Mile podcast, kcsportsnetwork.com has a link to it as well. There. John, once again, thanks so much for joining me. Really do appreciate it. Enjoy your flight. Enjoy your trip to Provo. We'll catch up a little bit later as well. But really good stuff. And again, go check him out. John Kurtz Show on YouTube. and OFNews.com. Thanks, Sean.
Hey, anytime. I appreciate it, Sean.
I ain't talking Kale. Boy, that team up north, man, but oh well. Player. We getting jiggy with that boy Cosmo. Hey. We granting kids wishes like that boy Cosmo. I got you. They steady hating on us, but we who they watch though. The Pac-12 mad, but we still on top, bro. Jaron Harder, Cody Epps, that's a cool connect. Yeah, my team is kinda old, but it's cool events. I'm hitting too hard. Ow, I hurt.